So the very first literary device present over here would be alliteration. What does alliteration do over here? It helps to conjure up the sounds of the storm wind. In the first stanza, for example, the hissing sibilants of the swift and sullen and speed and sweep, all of them are beginning with the word with the letter S, with the sound sibilants. All of them combine, and with this, it it is combined with the whooshing sound of the W letters sounds, and all these sounds together they evoke the feeling of the rush of the wind. And many of these W sounds are alliterative as well, which is wild, weed, and willow. Just look at one of the stanza over here as an example. And this is the stanza, along with its alliteration and sibilants together, it sounds like a storm itself. For example, when the swift rolling brook swollen deep, and all this stanza, beginning with W, while blowing winds again with V, W, weed with W, willow with W, and then swift and swollen. All these together are creating the sound of the storm. Now let us move on to the second example. For example, in the second stanza, the alliteration of holds his hat to his head. All these words are beginning with the sound of H. So this is the alliteration of H. This conveys the immense effort that takes this man to hold himself together and to hold his hat together and stop his hat from falling because of the wind. So many of the same sounds they appear in the final stanza. What are the same sounds which we are talking about? We're talking about the sibilance S, we're talking about the alliteration of the W, and then we're talking about the alliteration of H. But here, the effect of these sounds are different. Remember, the third stanza is completely opposite. It has been completely juxtaposed to the ideas which have been portrayed in the first two stanzas. Therefore, even though the sounds that appear in the final stanza, they might appear to be the same, but the effect is quite different. The H sound, the W sound, the S alliteration, or the sibilants of the poems, the final lines, they convey the peace and gentleness of the word. Previously, they were conveying the rushing of the wind, they were conveying the violence of the wind, but over here, they're conveying the peace and gentleness of the wind within the speaker's house. Let us look at the poem's closing couplet. So soft that a mother that's nigh her still cradle may hear her babe sigh. So the breathy H and the smooth S sounds are gentle over here, and they're evoking the sleeping baby's soft breath rather than the fearsome power of the storm. Let us move on to the second literary device, which is repetition. The wind, it features a lot of repetition. The speaker begins many lines with the phrase and the which is an example of anaphora. I mean, we've read and studied anaphora a lot of times. All these ands they create momentum and anticipation. The storm does this and this and this. So what next is the storm going to do? So whenever the word and is going to come over there, we're going to start waiting for the next thing which the storm can do. Now we can note over here in the third and the sixth line, which is featuring broader aspect of parallelism. And not only the words are repeating, but it can be said that the structure might also be repeating. And the wind blowing winds, sorry, and the wild blowing winds slowly sweep over the quivering leaf and the weed, and the willow tree rides in each limb over the sedge beds that reel by the brim. So, if you're going to look and compare these two stanzas, the first two verses of both the stanzas are beginning with the phrase and the word over, and the second one as well, and the and over. And look at the structure. And the wind blowing wind slowly sweep. Let's compare it with the structure of the second stanza. And the willow tree rides in each limb. Same structure. Over the quivering leaf and the weed. Look at the second one. Over sedge beds that reel by the brim. So this parallel language reflects the fact that the storm's influence is felt far and wide, affecting every inch of the landscape. Not only the grasses which are low, not only the leaves, but also the sedge beds, also the reeds, also the branches of the willow. So the speaker also repeats the phrase by the brim in the lines 6 and 8. The first time this phrase appears, it refers to the location of the grasses along the river bank. And in the next stanza, it refers to the edge of the man's hat. So, by repeating this frame, the poem emphasizes that the landscape and the human beings are equally subject to the storm's power. When the storm's power is being talked about, it is not only affecting the fields, the nature, but it's also affecting the human beings, the heart of the person. Let us move on to this next literary device, that is imagery. The storm wind contains dramatic imagery. The storm wind, it contains dramatic imagery throughout as the speaker describes the storm's power. The storm swells the water, the storm swells the waters of the swift rolling brook. Okay, so the winds are wild, the plants tremble, the tree limbs twist, and the grasses bend. What are we talking about? We're talking about the imagery which is present throughout the poem, which is reflecting the power of the storm. Now, what is the storm doing? It is swelling the waters of the swift rolling brook. What is the storm doing? It is resulting in the winds to be wild. It is resulting in the tremble of the plants. It is resulting in the limbs of the tree twisting. It is resulting in the grasses bending. So all this is an imagery, and this imagery is suggesting what? The power of the wind. So these vivid descriptions, it make it easier for the readers to envision the storm as it whips across every bit of the landscape, affecting delicate grasses, but not only the delicate grasses, but the thick tree branches also. And then the imagery of the final stanza is quite different, as the idea presented in the last stanza as compared to the first two stanzas is also completely different. Hey, the winds die away to become light swimming is. There is a clear juxtaposition between this calm imagery and the violent, chaotic imagery present in the previous stanzas. The next literary device would be personification. And we have talked about the personification later, previously also when we were discussing the poem. The poem uses some subtle personification as it describes the effects of the violent storm wind. The speaker says that the leaf and wheat, both of them are quivering. So who quivers? The human beings quiver. When why do the human beings quiver? The human beings quiver because when they're afraid, when they're frightened, when they're fearing something. So in the same way, if the leaves are not only swaying but they are being represented as quivering, it suggests that they are afraid of something. So the verb quiver just means to tremble or shake rapidly. It's a term which is often associated with human movement and emotion. So people quiver with fear or anxiety. So here the word suggests that the plants and water, they were all frightened by the storm. Similarly, the speaker says that a willow tree writhes in each limb. So in other words, the tree's branches, they are twisted like the arms of the human beings. When they are twisted, they are in pain. So again, the word writhes more typically refers to the people or maybe the animals, and it is associated with discomfort, and it is associated with pain. So it sounds as though the tree is being tortured by the storm. Because of the storm, the branches of the trees, they're not swaying, but they're in pain as well. They're in torture as well. They're in discomfort. So this personification emphasizes just how powerful this storm is. Now let us move on to the form, meter, and rhyme scheme of the storm wind. Yes, the form. The storm wind contains three sestes. The storm wind, it contains three sestes. Sestes means 6 lines. So therefore, there are three stanzas, and each stanza has 6 lines. So these can each be broken up further into a quatrain followed by a couplet based on the poem's rhyme scheme. Because the first four lines of the poem, they have a rhyme scheme, and the rhyme scheme of the final couplet is completely opposite to the first two lines. So therefore, that sestet can be divided into a quatrain and a couplet, only basing on the poem's rhyme scheme. So at first, this steady musical form seems at odds with the poem's content. Why? Because the poem is talking about wind, it is talking about the swaying of the wind, it is talking about the violence. Then how come the rhyme scheme of the poem is aligned in that manner. It why is does this rhyme scheme of the poem has a soothing and a smooth pattern. So as it is being suggested that the poem's first two stanzas they both describe as the violent power of the storm, and this makes both the landscape and people caught outside the house, in the field, in the open, tremble. So the final stanza reveals that the speaker is safe and sound at home. So the poem's predictable controlled form perhaps reflects the calm speaker feels in the sheltered nook of his house. So there are three stanzas. First two stanzas are talking about the violence of the nature. Okay, so in the same way, in the quatrain, if you go to divide the quatrain into two lines each, then the first two lines are actually talking about the violence of the storm against the nature. The second two lines are talking about the violence of the storm against the human beings. But the third two lines, which is a couplet, is completely opposite. Therefore, it is suggesting the rhyme scheme as well, the pattern of the rhyme scheme also. Let us move on to the meter now. The poem's meter is quite rough. It is not the same. There are variations in the meter, and these variations, if if the readers are going to understand and go into the complexities of these meters, it is going to keep the readers on their tones because it keeps on changing. So there is a galloping rhythm flowing through the poem that evokes the ferocious power, the violent power of the storm wind. Now, rhyme scheme. Already we've talked about rhyme scheme in the form. Let us talk about rhyme scheme individually as well. So the storm wind follows an A B rhyme scheme. Okay, and each quatrain then starts with four lines of the alternating rhymes, followed by a couplet that adds a sense of finality to the close of each stanza. Now, this brings us to the end of the rhyme scheme. And this brings us to the nearing end of the poem's analysis as well. Last two things. One is the literary context, and the other one is the historical context. Literary context. William Barnes was many things. He was not only a poet. He was a poet. He was a priest. He was a literary critic. He was a linguist. He was a mathematician. He was born in Dorset, which is present in the southwest of England, and he stayed over there for the majority period of his life. It's likely that the Dorset's landscapes they inspired the setting of the storm wind. With its steady stanza lengths and regular rhyme scheme, the storm wind is very much typical Victorian era poem in terms of its style because Victorian poets' approach to nature was varied. Many depicted the world as bleak, and they depicted the world in dark and dull and cynical terms. And some poets viewed nature through a religious lens, praising its majesty. But they were the third part. The third part, they described the nature in its emptiness. They described an emptiness in nature that they felt, which echoed humankind's loss of religious faith. And again, when they were talking about the emptiness in nature, they were actually talking about the loss of religious faith in the humankind. So the storm wind perhaps sits somewhere in between these two extremes, noting nature's capacity for destruction while also cherishing the shelter provided by a natural look in the land. This move makes us move on to this brings us to the last part of this poem analysis, which is historical context. Now, England towards the end of the 19th century was in the midst of second industrial revolution. Okay, so the second industrial revolution also led to widespread degradation of nature form. We already know that. And all that degradation of the nature, it was actually the result of exploitation through mining and through harvesting of natural resources, through the pollution which was emitted by the factories, and the expansion of the urban and the suburban spaces into what was formerly wilderness, something which was full of wild nature, but now it was completely transformed because of the industry. So it had the industrial effect on it. So many artists and writers they viewed this destruction of nature with alarm and despair. The description of the storm's power in this poem reflects a clear respect for nature's power. No matter how much are you going to affect the nature is always going to strike back. This poem is telling us about the power of the nature and how the human being must respect that power of the nature. So the Barnes, Mr. Barnes, was famously energetic as a religious leader, and the sheltering nook depicted in the storm wind might also evoke the comfort Barnes found in his faith in religion. So this brings us to the end of the poem. If you've got any questions, feel free to ask. Thank you so much. Jazakallah.